Hello, everyone, and welcome to the seminar of our monthly theories, where we aim to highlight rigorous research in the scientific study of international migration. We're so glad that you could join us today. My name is Jens Heinmüller. I'm a faculty co-director of IPL, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Before we begin, quickly a few housekeeping items. So the session is being recorded, and a recording of the presentation will be available on the IPL website and YouTube channel. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation by using the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen. During the last 15 minutes, I will select a few questions for a presenter to answer. We won't be able to answer all of the questions, obviously. At the end of the webinar, we'll send a link to a Google form in the Zoom chat where you can provide feedback and suggest future speakers. This link can also be found on the IPL website. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Leah Boustan. Leah is a professor of economics and the director of economic history at Yale University. Her research lies at the intersection of economic history and labor economics and has received widespread acclaim, including her recent book, Streets of Gold, America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success, being selected as the best book by the New Yorker. So we are really excited to have Leah and take it away. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you so much for having me. I am very excited to talk with you today about a project with 40 co-authors where we're studying the upward mobility of the children of immigrants whose parents settled in 15 different high-income destination countries. So you can see the list of the co-authors here. And this is a partnership of a variety of universities. So let me start with a little bit of background about how I got interested in this question. As Jens mentioned, my longtime collaborator, Ron Abramitski, and I recently published a book, Streets of Gold, about immigrant success in the United States, past and present. And what we found in this book really surprised us, namely that the children of immigrants in the United States experienced substantial upward mobility both in the past and today. So we had a sense before writing the book that there was common wisdom saying that it was easier for immigrants to move up the ladder 100 years ago when immigrants came primarily from Europe and entered into an economy that was heavily manufacturing based. And that today immigrants are having a harder time and their children are having a harder time moving up the ladder, given that immigrants come from a diverse set of sending countries and the economy has shifted towards services. But what we found was actually a very common story of success 100 years ago and today. So as we started to talk about this work with the public, the first time that I presented the book, the first question that I got was one that completely stumped me, but I found very interesting. Namely, is this pattern a sign of the American dream? Is there something specific about the institutions in the US and the long history of immigrant incorporation and immigrant receiving that makes it possible for there to be strong success for the children of immigrants now? Or is this simply a broader immigration story that the types of households, families, and individuals that move from their country of origin and find a way of resettling in a high-income country today simply have a set of attributes and characteristics that makes it possible for their children to succeed? And in particular, we know that there's large immigrant flows to European countries today, and there's a sense among the public that immigrants are having a harder time engaging in incorporation in Europe. So what does the data say? How does this story compare in the US and Europe? And indeed, if you look at the inflows of immigrants to the United States and to other high-income countries over the past 30 years or so, the US is no longer exceptional as an immigrant receiving location. So around 8% of the population in the US was foreign born in 1990, and it's around 14% in 2020. And you can see that those numbers are quite similar to other high-income destination countries. But at the same time, we have a sense that the history of immigrant incorporation in the US is different. And so we have this long 150-year history, first with arrivals from European countries processed here to Ellis Island in the early 20th century and establishing immigrant neighborhoods and enclaves in many US cities, sort of the classic Little Italies and so on. And then when the border closes to immigration in the 1920s, there's a period of low immigrant arrival, but then the border reopens in 1965, in part with efforts from President Kennedy and President Johnson. And now we have a immigrant community from around the world, with many holding legal permanent residency and citizenship. But at the same time, we also have a long history of immigrant exclusion in the US, starting with Chinese exclusion in the late 19th century, then border closure, I mentioned in the 1920s, and now substantial border enforcement and interior enforcement. So is there something distinctive about American history that makes it possible for immigrants and their children to succeed and flourish, or in fact is American history pushing in the opposite direction? So let me lead with what we find and then walk you through how we get there. So it turns out that the American experience of rapid success for the children of immigrants is not unique. In fact, we find similar patterns of strong upward mobility for the children of immigrants throughout what we are calling the Anglosphere. So this includes the US, but also Australia, Canada, Israel, and the UK, countries that have long connections to the British Empire, that began with a set of British institutions, and in the case of Australia, Canada, and Israel, along with the US, have long experience of immigrant arrival. In contrast, in much of continental Europe, we find a distinctive pattern where the daughters of immigrants are moving up as readily as in the Anglosphere, but the sons of immigrants are falling behind. So I want to argue today that this pattern is due to destination country institutions, the types of educational and labor market institutions that the children of immigrants are seeking to find their way within, rather than the set of sending country composition, sending country mix that differs between the Anglosphere and the continent. And then if I have time in my last 10 minutes or so, I want to discuss some new work on the political implications of these patterns. So what's unique about this 15-country project is really not the question or even the results for a couple of the countries, but it's the fact that we are harmonizing the administrative data for 14 of our destinations. We also add a survey for one for the UK, where we do not have administrative data at hand. So the fact that we're able to combine forces and define sample and variables similarly or equivalently across these countries and have direct comparisons. And importantly, we have parent-child linkages so that we can observe the parent's immigration status as well as the income within the parental household while the child was growing up. And then with links to the children in the labor market, we're able to see where the child lands in terms of their economic success. In particular, we're focusing on a cohort of children who are born in the destination country. So we're not looking at children who themselves migrate with their parents in the late 70s, early 80s. And then we divide this group of kids into two groups, children with a local born father and children with an immigrant father. And that's how we define who is the child of immigrants. Of course, we can also look at children with an immigrant mother, and we're able to do that in most of our countries, and results look very similar. Our measure of success is total individual income earned by the child when he or she is in their mid-30s. And we are currently working with the same team of co-authors to look at household income instead. Household income is uh, importantly different for those who marry and have spouses of different income levels. And so at the moment, we are going to be focusing only on the individual side. And for someone who is not working or is only working part-time, but who has a spouse who might be working, we're going to miss that piece of information. To measure the childhood household, we're looking at total parental family income when the kids were in their teenage years. And then for both the parent and for the child, we calculate their rank within the income distribution in their age group or birth cohort. So let me start with a couple of facts that allow you to compare the outcomes of the first generation, the immigrants themselves, and the second generation, the children of immigrants, across our destinations. Now, this picture is something that you could calculate with repeated cross-sectional data from censuses, for example. So we're not directly using parent-child linkages yet, and I'll do that for the rest of the slides. But just to sort of fix ideas, what we can see here are the set of destination countries in the data organized on the left-hand side by the country with the largest first-generation earnings gaps relative to local-born workers. And that is France, where immigrant workers earn 20 rank points less than the average French-born worker. And then as you move over to the right-hand side, you see countries where that gap diminishes and even turns at the end to a premium in favor of the immigrant groups. Now, from this picture, you can see a couple of important differences between the US and Europe. So first of all, in the US, children of immigrants are raised at around the median household. So there's a distribution of households in which children of immigrants are raised, of course, but on average, the household in which they're raised is no different than the household of a US-born child. In the US, in the EU, especially in France, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, to some extent, you see that children of immigrants are raised in poor households, substantially below the median for the local born. I'm highlighting the US and Denmark as one sort of contrast that you can keep in mind. This is simply because there's already a relatively similar US paper, which was our paper originally, and a Danish paper, which is the paper of our co-authors, Alan Manning and Matthias Jensen, that are published. And so this contrast between US and Denmark, I'll kind of carry through so we can fix ideas. The second difference is that in the US, we can see that the mobility from the first generation to the second generation is balanced by gender. So both the sons and daughters of immigrants are moving up to around the same degree. Whereas in Denmark and in many other European destinations, we see that sons of immigrants are moving up relative to their parents, but not to the same extent as their sisters. And finally, you can see that the US is not exceptional. There's relatively similar patterns in the rest of the Anglosphere, where we see that immigrants who arrive in Australia or the UK or Canada are not as poor as immigrants who arrive on the continent. So the children of immigrants in those countries are raised in relatively average households, and we see something that looks closer to gender balance in the Anglosphere as well. Okay, so now I want to focus on the parent-child links to look directly at upward mobility. And the contrast is going to be between children of immigrants and children of local born who were raised at the same point in the income distribution when they're kids, and looking at where they reach in the distribution as they grow up. I'm going to start with the US. So that we can get a sense of what this type of figure is going to look like. Then I'll contrast the US to Denmark, and then we can look at all of the countries arrayed together. So this figure for the US, we've already published before. This is something that I worked on with Ron, as well as our co-authors, Elisa Jacome and Santi Perez. What you can see in the gray bars here is the distribution of households um, uh, in which children of immigrants are raised. And on the x-axis, we have parental income rank. And the gray bars, which we can read off the secondary y-axis, tells you what share of children of immigrants are raised in households at each ventile. So you can see that the distribution is relatively flat, and there are children of immigrants who are being raised in each household type. And then if we look at the circles up above, what we're looking at here is for children of immigrants and children of US born who are raised at each ventile of the income distribution, what is their average earnings rank themselves when they grow up and they're in the labor market in their 30s? So, of course, if you're raised in a poor household, on average, your rank is not as high as if you're raised in a rich household. And so we have the upward sloping relationship that we're used to from other work. But what I want to call our attention to is the difference between the children of immigrant fathers in the closed diamonds relative to the children of US born fathers in the open circles. And we can see that all the way up to the 75th percentile, the sons of immigrant fathers are earning more than the sons of US born fathers. And so there is a child of immigrant premium in terms of upward mobility. But in contrast, in Denmark, we see the opposite pattern in a couple of ways. First of all, in terms of the distribution of households in which children of immigrants are raised, like other continental European countries, children of immigrants are very concentrated at the lower end of the distribution when they are in childhood. So they're being raised in households that are below the 25th percentile in large number. And then if we focus on these dots, especially those at the low end of the distribution, where most of the mass would be concentrated, we see that there's, rather than having a son of immigrant premium, we see a son of immigrant penalty, so that at each point in the parental income distribution, we see sons of immigrants earning less than similar sons of locals. These were actually the figures that we were looking at with Alan and Matthias when we decided it would be worthwhile to do a major cross-country study. And so the analysis that I'm going to show you for the rest of the talk it's coming out of that initial conversation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on kids raised at the 25th percentile. And I will show you a bar chart where what we're going to look at are the gaps between sons of immigrants and sons of locals, and then we'll do the same thing for daughters across all 15 destinations. So rather than flash 15 of these plots at you, on the next slide, I'm going to show you those gaps for the 15 countries for kids raised at the 25th percentile. So I've just highlighted the US case where there's around a 5 rank point advantage for sons of immigrants, and then the Danish case where there's around a 3 to 4 rank point disadvantage or penalty for being the son of an immigrant. And you can see that in the US case, there's sort of this American dream story going on, but the US is not alone. That in fact, the US looks quite similar to the UK and Israel, as well as Canada. And then we see Australia kind of coming in a bit lower, where there's neither a son of immigrant penalty or premium. Denmark, by contrast, looks quite similar to the rest of the continent: Austria, Netherlands, Switzerland, Spain, Norway, Sweden, France. So if we were looking only at sons, we would say, okay, well, it's not an American dream, but it's an Anglosphere dream. There's something about being one of these New World countries that receive British institutions. And then we would try to understand which of the facets might be explaining what's going on. But the story's a little more complicated because when we look at the daughters of immigrants, in fact, the US is not exceptional. The daughters of immigrants in the US are certainly doing well. They're moving up faster than the daughters of locals raised at the same point in the distribution, but there's really um, nothing exceptional about the US here. In fact, daughters of immigrants are doing well everywhere except Austria and Germany. So, what we then are trying to ask ourselves here is why is mobility for sons of immigrants low in some destinations and high in others? And in order to answer that question, we always have to keep in mind that any explanation we have needs to apply to the sons of immigrants, but not the daughters. So the first thing that came to our mind was sending country composition. We know that the U.S. has immigrants primarily from Latin America and Asia, whereas many European destinations have immigrants primarily from the Middle East and North Africa, as well as from other European countries. So could that be what's going on? And we'd have to tell a complicated story here where, being the child of a Turkish or Moroccan immigrant is bad for the sons, but not for the daughters. And so it's not just sending country composition, but sending country interacted with gender. Is it immigrant selectivity by destination, even within a sending country? So it could be that Turkish immigrants that move to Germany and Austria are different from Turkish immigrants that move to Canada or the US. And so it's really about individual attributes, education, wealth, etc. We try to consider these options, and I'll show you a little bit of evidence along these lines. But we seems to us from our reading of the data that it's not consistent with these stories. And so then we turn to destination country institutions, focusing on education and labor market institutions that would help incorporate children of immigrants, as well as immigration and citizenship policy. So I'm going to show you one slide on these kinds of selection stories, and I'll just tell you a bit more about what we're doing beyond that one slide, and then I'll move to destination country attributes. So here, I think, is a very illuminating way of thinking about sending country mix and whether it's explaining what might be going on. This slide has a lot going on inside of it, though, so let me just pause to say, what are we looking at here? Here, each one of the columns is one of our destination countries. Right now, we only have 11. We're trying to incorporate the US here as well, but there are some countries where we don't have permission to release information at the sending country level. The rows are the sending countries, just alphabetically. In the columns, we're organizing the destinations from those destinations with the lowest outcomes for the sons of immigrants, Netherlands and Austria, to those with the highest outcomes, Canada and Israel. And what we see here is that there are few origin countries, few rows, where there's high or low mobility for the sons of these immigrants across all destinations. So it's not that if your parent comes from um, uh, Greece or comes from South Korea that you're doing well everywhere or doing poorly everywhere. But rather, there seems to be quite a lot of variation within a sending country as you go across different destinations. So let me give you some examples. So Morocco and Turkey are good examples because there's a large number of inflow to all of our destinations. So we get most of the cells covered. Inside of the cells, we're looking at the P25 gap, which is what I was showing you in the bar charts before. But each cell is now for a destination sending country pair. And then the color is indicating whether the sons of immigrants in that cell are doing particularly poorly or particularly well relative to the sons of locals. And red means poorly, blue means well. So you can see that if your father comes from Morocco and you're in the Netherlands, you're doing especially badly. As you move to Switzerland, case still not doing so well. And as you keep moving across the row, we see that eventually when we get to Israel and Canada, the sons of Moroccan fathers are doing quite well relative to locals. Turkey, similar pattern. We can also look at Germany and Italy, which are, of course, destination countries, but they're also sending countries. They send to most of the destinations in our data. And we see that the sons of German or Italian immigrants in Austria are not doing that well. And as you move across the row, the colors improve. You can also look at refugee countries, like from our time period, that would be Chile, Iran, or Vietnam. These are countries that would not have had as much of a choice of where to settle. And we see a similar pattern where there are some destinations where the sons of immigrants from these countries are doing poorly and some where they're doing well. And then there are some cases like China and India where in most destinations, sons are doing well. So there are a few cases that look more like a country of origin story. But for the most part, as you look row by row, you see something that looks much more like a destination story. So overall, we see that there are certain destinations where sons of immigrants from each one of the sending countries are doing well, and some where each are doing poorly. This is what leads us to believe that we're in a world where destination country effects matter more than sending country effects. Now, of course, there's other elements here on the individual selection level. So it could be that the types of Moroccan immigrants that move to Canada are very different from the types that move to Austria. We don't have a lot of individual attributes in our data set because it's coming from tax records. So the first thing that we do is try to consider destination by sending country cell attributes. So on average, what are the education levels of Turkish immigrants to Canada versus Turkish immigrants to Austria? In general, what is the distance between those two country pairs? What are the linguistic differences between those country pairs? And we don't see that these matter very much. We have a few individual attributes we can also consider, primarily the parents' industry of occupation, the parents' municipality of residence, and the parents' asset levels in terms of home ownership and other things that might show up in tax data. Controlling for these don't matter either, but we don't have individual level parental education, for example. So we can't completely rule out the idea that there might be some within sending country selection, but the patterns we're seeing here in the heat map are much more suggestive of destination country effects. So what is it about a destination country that helps sons incorporate in some locations but not others? So one sort of proxy measure that we can consider for a wide range of education and labor market institutions is the income compression or income distribution in that country, as proxied here by the Gini coefficient. And so I'm replicating here for our small set of 15 destinations, a relatively well-known pattern, and people have even given this pattern a name. They call it the Great Gatsby curve, whereby upward mobility, which is what we've been interested in, is higher in countries that have income compression, that have institutions that allow the income distribution to be tighter. Those are the same sets of institutions that seem to support upward mobility. So this downward sloping relationship between the Gini coefficient and upward mobility has been called the Great Gatsby curve. That's true for the sons of locals, but it's completely opposite for the sons of immigrants. And so it was this pattern that also suggested to us that what we might be observing here is something having to do with the sets of institutions at the education and labor market level that support upward mobility and income compression for locals, but seem to be inaccessible or where there are barriers created that prevent access for the sons of immigrants. I'm going to, because I'm mindful of time, I'm going to skip through citizenship policy, which we think may also play a role, because I want to talk through a couple of slides on the set of institutions that we think are potentially supportive of upward mobility for locals, but are creating barriers for sons of immigrants. So let me talk through the education policy that we think might be playing a role. If we think about continental Europe, the destinations where the sons of immigrants are not moving up as readily, uh, the educational system tends to have this three-part structure where there's compulsory schooling up to what would be the equivalent of like a high school dropout, 10th or 11th grade in the US. Then there's a vocational or an apprenticeship track that allows um, for additional training and then moving into blue collar professions. And then there's an academic track. If we look at the sons of immigrants, we see relatively equal balance across these three tracks. If we look at the sons of locals, we see that there's much more usage of the vocational and apprenticeship track. So in fact, there's no difference between the sons of immigrants and sons of locals in the usage of the academic track, academic high school or a BA or beyond. But where the major difference lies is in the usage of the or access to the vocational and apprenticeship training track. By the way, this is data right now that I'm presenting for the case of Denmark, and we're working on building this up in our other partner countries. Importantly, the vocational track is much more important as a share of the population for men than for women. And so if the sons of immigrants are having a hard time accessing the vocational and apprenticeship track, which is is a set of institutions that are often pointed to as providing upward mobility and leading to income compression, but yet there's a barrier preventing sons of immigrants from accessing this institution, then this could help us explain the poor outcomes for the sons of immigrants on the continent, and also the gender differences on the continent as well, because this is a track that's particularly used by men and not by women. So there, as it turns out, there is a pretty large literature primarily in sociology about barriers to entering vocational programs for immigrants and the sons of immigrants in the trades and in manufacturing. And that seems to be borne out in our data. So what's different about the Anglosphere? Claudia Golden sums up in the case of the US a very different set of educational institutions that she says has the virtue of being open to all. So because the US K through 12 education system was originally locally financed by local property taxes, it was not possible for a local area to prevent some of the residents from sending their children to the high school. And so the high school system in the US is not one with testing and tracking, where you get tested at age 11 or at age 14 into a vocational or an academic track, but rather it's a system that is open to all residents. It could be that this type of open system is particularly valuable for the children of newcomers. So the final point I want to make on this is some really hot off the presses data that we recently disclosed from the Census RDC for the case of the US. And here we find, precisely as we would expect if the educational system is what's mattering, that the children of immigrants relative to the children of US born have higher education levels. At each point of the parental income distribution, and that this accounts for much of the income advantage that I've already showed you in the case of the US. So, of course, we're not that surprised if we look at the children of immigrants from Asia. This is sort of that classic tiger mother story where even if there's Asian families at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, the parents themselves may have arrived with education that they're not able to fully actualize in the labor market, but they take this education that they're arriving with and they use this to help support the kids. And the kids, the children of Asian immigrants, are able to attain higher education and to thrive. So here in the purple bar, we see the unadjusted earnings gap for the sons of Asian immigrants versus the sons of US born. And then in the other colors, we see how that gap changes if we simply add educational fixed effects for the child. And we see that a large portion of the purple gap can be accounted for by the fact that the sons of Asian immigrants have higher education. Probably not that surprising. But what really surprised us is that this pattern is true almost across the board for children of immigrants whose parents come from Europe, from Africa, from Caribbean, from Anglo countries, and from the Middle East. However, when we look at the children of immigrants whose parents come from Latin American countries, we actually see that sons and daughters of these immigrants have an earnings advantage, but that earnings advantage is not explained by educational differences. And so there's a blue collar pathway to advancement that's being taken by the children of Latin American immigrants, and a white collar pathway to advancement that's being taken by the rest of the child of immigrant group. Overall, because children of Latin American immigrants represent around half of the sample, we see that education is a reasonably small share of the overall accounting. But within group, we can see that education is explaining 60 to 100% of the income advantage in most of our different regional groups. So, I managed to reserve 9 to 10 minutes to talk about the political implications of some of these patterns. So overall, these patterns, like in my mind, led to somewhat of a political puzzle. Why, if assimilation outcomes are so positive in the US, is immigration politics so negative? And there's also a flip side of this puzzle when it comes to Europe, which I'll get to in a minute or two. But on the US side, we're not that surprised, to take a look at some headlines and notice a fair amount of negative immigration politics. And here I'm using a number of examples from President Trump, including some very recent language from the past couple of weeks. So to resolve this puzzle, it turns out that US immigration politics is not as negative as we think. And so first, I'm going to show you that Trump is an outlier among US presidents in the past 30 or 40 years. That in fact, the Democrats are the most positive party about immigration in our full OECD sample, which includes a wide variety of countries that were also in our 15-country study. And that the Republicans, while on average negative about immigration, are focused on crime and legality and not on labor or economic issues. And also that the UK, with a very positive set of assimilation outcomes, also has a positive immigration consensus as well. So in terms of what we hear from the executive branch, okay, it is true that Trump is very much an outlier and has a lot of negative things to say about immigration. So what are we looking at here? Each one of these underlying dots is a congressional representative or senator, and we're looking at their speeches that are on immigration topics, and we're classifying the speeches as either pro, neutral, or anti-immigration. And then for each individual, we can say what share of their speeches are pro and what share are anti. Around 40% of speeches are neutral. And so if we have something like -50, this is saying that around 60% of speeches are anti and 10% are pro. That's where Trump lies. But we can see that most of our presidents for the past 50 years or so have been very positive on immigration. When it comes to congressional representatives, we can compare political parties in the US to a set of other countries in the OECD. This comes from congressional record speeches in the US as well as parliamentary papers in the European comparison countries. And we see that the Democrats are actually the most positive party in the OECD about immigration. Again, same metric where you see that here, around 60% of speeches would be positive and 10% would be negative on immigration, leading to a net number of 50 for the Democrats. The Republicans were more in the midst of the center right when it comes to comparing Republicans to European countries. But when we compare Republicans to the rest of our sample on the topics underlying immigration speeches, we see that Republicans are no more likely to mention economic issues, meaning fiscal, taxing, expenditures, and no more likely to mention labor issues. In fact, if anything, it's the Democrats who are talking more about labor issues than the Republicans in their immigration speeches. But immigration speeches made by Republicans are by far and away more likely to be mentioning crime, legal issues, and security threats relative to the rest of the OECD center-right parties. So the fact that we have positive economic news, that immigrants in the US are doing well and that their children are doing even better, is actually reflected in the set of topics that the anti-immigration party chooses to cover. And we see a very similar pattern when it comes to the UK. So we've broken our sample down into two periods and looking at the US and the UK in the early period. And then in the more recent era, we see that there has become in the UK a very strong positive consensus where both the center right and center left in the UK, reflected by the pink and the blue circles, are lying right on top of each other. And net quite positive on immigration. Here we can see that in the US, of course, there's polarization between Republicans and Democrats, but as I just mentioned, the anti-immigration speeches that Republicans give are not talking about economic or labor issues. So the real puzzle, as I see it, is not that the US has negative immigration politics. In fact, there's a number of ways in which immigration politics in the US is quite positive. But the real puzzle is why did European countries that had low immigrant earnings and low mobility for the sons of immigrants have such a strong positive mainstream political consensus on immigration for so long? And in our sample of political speeches, we cover Austria, France, Denmark, and Sweden, which are four countries where we see that the immigrant generation is earning a lot less than locals and that the sons of immigrants are doing particularly poorly. Political realignment is happening, but it's only now underway. And this slow adjustment may have given some political mileage or a lane for the far right to emerge. So I will end with this figure here. There are a lot of countries going on, but I want to just focus on Austria, Denmark, France, and Sweden. This is the early period in our data, and we can see that in this early period, which leads exactly up to the point at which the sons or daughters in our data set were measured for their adult outcomes, we see that Austria, Denmark, France, and Sweden all had political consensus on immigration, with their main center-right and main center-left party lying right on top of each other in the way that they speak about immigration. And if anything, they're on the positive side of the ledger. Here in Austria, Denmark neutral, France neutral, and Sweden positive. And it was only recently that we start to see the parties breaking apart. From 2015 onward, we see polarization opening up in Austria, with the center right shifting to the negative side of the ledger. We see polarization opening up in France, polarization opening up in Sweden. And we also notice a much larger role for far-right parties, who are, of course, very far to the anti-immigration side in that later part of the period. So to put all of this together, what we're seeing from these two US-Europe projects together is that, first of all, the American dream is still alive. That's what we learned from our Streets of Gold book. It's not only a province of the late 19th century, but even in the recent period, children of immigrants are able to move up quite readily. But it's not purely an American dream. Children of immigrants are also thriving in Australia, Canada, Israel, and the UK. In Europe, the story is somewhat different. Daughters of immigrants doing quite well, sons of immigrants falling behind. And so when we see how these patterns are reflected in politics, we see indeed that the US and UK does seem to absorb the positive news. The immigration politics there is not as negative as we think, but up until 2014 or so, there would be a very strong puzzle of why European politics was so consensus driven and so positive. It's only adjusting now with a lag. So I will break here and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Jens, should I close my slides
You
for
can close
the
the slides or leave them on, it doesn't matter really. But
okay.
yeah, thanks so much, Leah, for a fascinating presentation. Can only imagine the amount of work it takes to coordinate the 40 co-authors and all of these different data sources from all of the different countries. We have a couple of questions, so I'll just get started. The first one is from Ahmed. He's interested in whether you are able to observe differential marriage rates with natives by gender in your data. He's wondering in particular if marriage and the associated right it confers might partly explain the daughter's stronger upward mobility, which might matter less in countries that have birthright citizenship, etc. But we're just wondering whether you could comment on that.
Okay, Ahmed, that's a great question. That's exactly what we're trying to work on right now with our co-author team. I'm sorry that I don't have a strong answer for you yet because the work is, in the field, so to speak. But when we saw these individual earnings patterns, we immediately wondered whether marriage would accentuate or undo some of the gender differences. So, for example, if the daughters of immigrants are moving up by finding a good workplace or entering a good educational program, they might meet the son of a local born in those locations who earns a fair amount. And then together, the daughter of immigrant, son of local born earn quite a lot in household income terms. Alternatively, it could be that the daughters of immigrants are marrying the sons of immigrants from the same ethnic community. The daughters are doing well, the sons are doing poorly, and that would undo the gender gaps that we see. So I don't know yet which pattern we will find. From the qualitative work from sociology and so on, we suspect it's going to be more like the first story, where because the daughters of immigrants are on this pathway to upward mobility, along that path, they meet the sons of locals and they are somewhat exiting the ethnic community in terms of where their household is located and what their economic position looks like. And that is going to even further separate sisters from brothers in terms of their final outcomes. But I would have to come back maybe in like 2 years and share that work with the rest of you.
Thank you. Another a question from Claire Adida. She's saying such important work. Thank you. I'm wondering if you could say more about the composition of the control group and whether there is variation by country that might be driving some of these patterns. So, for example, in some countries, many of the domestic born are themselves children of foreign born, or in some countries, the local born are more racially diverse than in other countries. Could this be driving some of the patterns?
Um, yeah. So interesting question. I mean, so with I I don't think that there's going to be many in the child of local born group that are um, third generation because of the immigration history at hand. So these are kids who are born in the 80s. And if your parent is not him or herself an immigrant, the chances of your grandparent being is relatively low, given that the border was closed, not just in the US, but actually in much of the historically immigrant receiving areas from around 1920 until the 60s or 70s. The exact details on that differ country by country, but there was sort of a global pattern towards reversing globalization in the 20s and into the Great Depression period. So I don't think we have to worry about this sort of third generation. But in terms of racial composition, yes, absolutely. In particular, in places like the US, Canada, and Australia, it would be interesting to compare immigrants with sort of same racial group. So other native born Hispanic, other native born Asian, and we haven't done that, but that's a really good suggestion which we can take a look at.
Great. So another question from Andrew. Um, he was wondering whether you could comment a little bit on whether some of the patterns might be accounted for by differences in the different legal statuses that the migrants have once they arrive in the country. So these countries differ in terms of the types of migrants they take in, refugees, family reunification, temporary protection, labor migration with these different channels. And so he's wondering whether that might explain some of the patterns that you see.
Yeah, I mean that's the one finding that I did have to skip over because I tried to pack in so much. Absolutely, it's so important. We look at this in a couple of different ways. The Migrant Integration Policy Index is one way that one thing we really like because it comes with 8 different domains. And in particular, the thing that we focus on most is the domain that they call access to nationality. And it's focusing on whether the second generation, the children of immigrants themselves, are able to get immediate citizenship in the case of the birthright citizen, places like the U.S. and Canada with birthright citizenship, or in other countries, there's a variety of barriers that are in place, and in some countries, there's no access to citizenship and no possible pathway. And so what we find there is that there is a very strong correlation with upward mobility and access to nationality. Um, what's interesting is that this is true for both sons and daughters. So I think that this is an important part of the story in terms of the underlying mobility rates, but can't help us explain the gender differences that we see. So I didn't emphasize that today, but that is a piece of the paper, and it's absolutely important that in places where second generation don't have access to citizenship, their mobility lags behind.
Great. Another question is about language and language barriers to sort of upward mobility, and whether that's maybe easier in these Anglosphere countries where you have English sort of as a common language, or whether that might be more difficult in some other countries like, say, Germany or Austria, whether that might contribute as well.
So all of these are kids who are born in the destination country and are educated in a destination country educational institutions. That being said, I mean, it might be that you don't speak the the um, the language of your new destination until you get to school. And so you still might go through life with language limitation, even if you're educated in the destination country. But I did want to first at least flag that these results are all for kids who are born in the destination country. Um, One thing that we're trying to incorporate right now is linguistic difference between the parents' origin country and their settlement location. We don't have those results yet. I mean, that's relatively straightforward, but it's just something that we only recently started to think about. So thank you for pushing us on that.
Thank you. Another question from Paola. She's asking whether an alternative story for the differences across countries could be network effects while you're comparing the bottom 25th percentile. If in one country has more successful groups, is it possible that this plays a role? Can you check that? And what about Italy, not an Anglo-Saxon country, but seems to be doing very well?
Yeah, okay. So I'll take the Italy one first. So I mentioned that there were a few parental attributes at the individual level that we can control for, and that they usually don't make a difference. Italy is actually the counterexample. So the reason why the sons of immigrants in Italy are doing well in the kind of raw data where we're only looking at parental income but nothing else is because immigrants to Italy in the early 1980s, around the time these kids were born, almost all lived in the north, and the north of Italy had much higher earnings than the south. And so once we control for parental geography or the geography of childhood household, the what looks like a son of immigrants advantage in Italy disappears. So if you're comparing people who are in the same region, then that gap is no longer positive. Um, so the first part of the comment, I got really excited about the Italy thing. Jens, could you remind me?
It's a story about like network effects. So,
Yeah.
okay.
Okay. So, we're working right now, like I said, on for things like linguistic distance between parental country of origin and destination. Another attribute that is sort of a sending country by destination country attribute is just group size. So that would be one element of your network. And another attribute is average level of group education. So if you think back to sort of the original Borjas papers on ethnic capital, he uses education level of your group as a measure of your group ethnic capital. So those are two things that we've incorporated recently. And what we're finding is, as you would suspect, being a member of a group that on average has high education, even if your parents are at the 25th percentile, helps you. And so, like, you might be at the 25th percentile with a father from Turkey and Canada, but Turkish immigrants to Canada are mostly doctors, and so the average education level is quite high, and that's beneficial. So, exactly as you would suspect, we do see this kind of like network component coming through. However, it doesn't seem to really chip away at the destination country effects, which is what we're especially interested in. So it doesn't seem to be that the reason why Austria looks worse than Canada is simply because there are groups in Canada that have these positive networks and groups in Austria that don't. Rather, even a group that sort of equally positive in both of those countries still has a Canada benefit and an Austria um, penalty. So the answer to your question is sort of yes and no, if that makes sense.
Thank you. There's a lot of questions about policy, and so I'll just pick two of these. The first one is from Andre. He's asking, do you think it makes sense to design welfare or family support policies that specifically target low-income immigrant families with children, or is it better to focus on low-income families in general if the goal is to raise mobility? And if you were designing those programs, how should they, if at all, differ for immigrant families compared to low-income native-born families?
This is a really excellent question. I mean, what I think I'm learning from our work so far is that a lot of the institutions that are set up in a country to help low income children who are raised in low income environments are not necessarily accessible to all. So we have to think not only about the program, but also about access to the program. And some of that is kind of, learning the hidden curriculum, so to speak. Like, how do you figure out the educational system? And like, what does it mean that the testing happens at age 11? Some of it has to do with networks that are already in place that help incumbents, but that are not available to newcomers. So, like networks into vocational training is often through family networks. Like you go to the same program that your father went to or your uncle went to. And that kind of strategy can work when you have primarily a closed society, a closed economy. But as you start to welcome newcomers, that type of program can create sort of bifurcation or two different classes in terms of access. So I think that we don't necessarily need to rethink the programs themselves, but we need to rethink access to the programs.
Thank you. I'll pick one last question on the policy. So, given that you identified these institutional factors as driving maybe some of the more successful upward mobility outcomes across these countries, what are policy levers that more local policymakers could use to improve integration? So, what is within their purview of, say, state or city governments, who certainly vary by country? What about programs that they could do to improve upward mobility?
Um, so this is really getting into the weeds of how educational systems work, right? So it depends country by country and what's already been done to try to think about access. I mean, there's really simple things like, making sure that all of the information that's coming from the school is translated into a variety of languages so that parents who are newcomers and may not speak the local language have information from the school. It may have to do with, what's going on with guidance counselors or that type of a figure who are helping kids decide like how to study or what kind of track they might have open to them. But there's a whole variety of approaches that our sociologists point to in terms of how it is that these um, educational systems are on the face of them completely neutral on the basis of background or identity, but in the reality of them seem to um, work for locals and not for newcomers. And I think each one of those, it's beyond our ability to actually provide exact guidance, but I think there's a number of like, there's low-hanging fruit that hasn't been tried that might be quite successful here.
Okay, great. So, very last questions. I know there's many questions that I will not be able to get to, but we will send all of those your way so you have them. Last question is about geographic mobility and the differences between immigrant, sort of children of immigrants versus children of natives, and whether those differences might explain some of the patterns. So, mobility in particular, maybe being higher in these Anglosphere countries than in the continental European countries.
Um, Interestingly, we're just starting to dive into this in the US, but it seems like the children of immigrants are less likely to move in their own adulthood than the children of locals. Some of this has to do with immigrant parents arriving as newcomers to a country and maybe selecting a destination that is one that generates upward mobility, whereas children of locals are sort of endowed into a location that may have been the location their family has been in for a number of generations. And so if your parent has already, re-optimized, so to speak, then the children themselves don't necessarily have to move again. So actually, when it comes to geographic mobility, that's a pathway to success more for local born, at least when we're looking at children of U.S. born, more so than children of immigrants. I don't know how much that fact generalizes. Um, but at least from the theoretical perspective, it makes sense that if the parent generation gets to optimize once, the child generation might not need to do it again.
Thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. There's many unanswered questions that I have. We'll send those your way, but thank you all in the audience for joining and for your engagement with the questions. And thank you, Leah, again for doing this really fascinating research and very important, obviously. I have to close now, but I'm already looking forward to our next seminar, which is going to be on January 8th with Mary Waters from Harvard University, who will be presenting. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you so much, all.